The zigzag foot is often known as the general, or all-purpose sewing foot, because it can support straight sewing as well as a zigzag. The zigzag foot is probably the most useful and versatile presser foot in your sewing machine toolbox. It is most likely the foot that stays on your machine all the time because it can be used for straight sewing and zigzag as well as a variety of decorative stitches. Zigzag may sound like a haphazard approach to sewing stitches. However, it is this characteristic sewing movement that makes the zigzag foot such a useful foot on every machine. No sewer wants to be without this foot. It is most likely among the standard feet included in the basic kit that comes with your sewing machine. What is zigzag stitch? A zigzag stitch is a geometric side-to-side stitch used for seam finishing, decorative sewing and sewing stretch fabric. Zigzag stitching can be adjusted by changing the settings on the machine. A higher number on your stitch length makes the zigzag longer, and the width dial will indicate the width of the stitch and change it to wider or narrower. A long stitch, zigzagging close together, produces a stitch called satin stitch. This can be used for applique or buttonholes. The zigzag stitch can be just plain useful or very decorative. Presser foot for a zigzag. Most of the time you can use the all-purpose presser foot for sewing zigzag. Some machines have a zigzag or satin stitch foot, which has a slight groove underneath and a wider hole. Zigzag foot. With its wide opening, the zigzag foot allows the needle extra movement from side to side. This is the movement for many decorative stitches. This foot can cope with wide and narrow zigzag stitches and many other useful functions. The design of the opening of the foot enables this foot to also sew straight stitches, and therefore it can remain on the machine most of the time for straightforward sewing tasks, zigzagging and decorative stitches. Zigzag foot and stitch adjustments. Play around with your zigzag stitch length or width on your machine. The different lengths make the stitch smaller or larger, and the different widths give a wider or narrow stitch. Always try out the stitch on a scrap of fabric to be sure it is exactly what you want, and the stitch lengths or widths you use to achieve the stitch. Making a sampler and writing on the fabric the stitch length and width you set the machine on could save you a great deal of time in the future. You just have to refer to your sampler to choose the zigzag stitch you think is most suited to the task on hand. Tension for zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch is a strong stitch, but if the tension is too tight the stitch will pucker and snap. Always check your sewing machine tension before trying the stitch on new fabrics. It is possible to work a zigzag stitch by hand, but as most machines carry this stitch option, hand sewing a zigzag stitch is not really a necessary stitch to learn.